My name is Nikki Wright. I'm a co-chairperson of the African Pangolin Working Group. We're an organisation dedicated to conservation of all four of Africa's pangolin species.
Our work involves research, conservation, the veterinary treatment of injured pangolins that have come in off the trade, and the rehabilitation process of those pangolins. On World Pangolin Day, which is the 15th of February 2025,
we launched and opened our very own facility in the Lafalala Wilderness in the Waterberg Biosphere in Limpopo Province in South Africa. And it's called a pangolarium. It's essentially a dedicated facility for the treatment of pangolins which have come off the trade.
If you would like to support our work, please go to our website, africanpangolin.org, where our work is showcased. And with easy ways to donate, you too can get involved in the movement to support pangolin conservation.
The African Pangolin Working Group. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and africanpangolin.org.
Hello, and welcome back to Restoring Planet Podcasts with me, your host, Jack Cole. So today, I'm joined by Alexis Kriel, who's down in Johannesburg. He's going to tell us some bits and pieces about pangolins. So first of all, Alexis, welcome. If start by telling us a little bit about your background and how it is that you came to be doing what it is that you're doing.
Thanks so much, Jack. And lovely to be here with your viewers talking about pangolins. Jack, I come from a media background as a journalist and in the film industry. I started working with wildlife in 2012, doing rehabilitation of urban wildlife in Johannesburg, and then became aware of the situation with pangolins and the illegal trade, which started to increase, and we were being made aware of it, and pangolins were sporadically being retrieved from the illegal wildlife trade from 2009, before I got involved with wildlife, but I became more aware of it in around 2012 when I was working with wildlife, and then took a volunteer opportunity to go and work with two pangolin pups in the Central African Republic, a black-bellied pangolin pup and a white-bellied pup, and stayed there in a clearing of the rainforest in Central Africa for 2 months. And when I came back, I was invited to join the African Pangolin Working Group and have remained with the organization, moving from a director role to a position of the co-chair and executive director on the group. So I have moved all the way from media and having my own businesses sporadically, and then into wildlife quite late for me, because it's something that I so love, and I wish I'd got involved with it earlier on in my life.
Lovely. And so tell us about pangolins. So there are 4 species. Whereabouts are they found, and what's their life cycle, their ecology? What do they get up to?
So, Jack, there are actually 8 species of pangolin, 4 African pangolin. Yeah, so you are referring to the 4 African species, and we're centered in Johannesburg, South Africa, but we do work across Africa. So I'll tell you about the 4 African pangolin species. I mean, basically, it's interesting because pangolins have been on the planet for about 84 million years. So essentially they're crossover with dinosaurs, and they are conspecific species. So if you go back millions of years in time, you probably get back to the splitting of the continents. And that's why there are conspecific species. So similar species in Asia to what we have in Africa. And we have 4 pangolin species here. So they're basically the Temminck's pangolin, the white-bellied pangolin, black-bellied pangolin, and the giant pangolin. So going through them individually, the Temminck's pangolin is the pangolin species that we get in South Africa, but on the northern reaches, so where we border Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Botswana. And then the Temminck's goes right up in a thick swathe up to Angola and Zambia and up the east side of Africa as far as Chad. Yes. So you've got that thick swathe in northern Africa and then along the west coast and up sort of across again up to Chad. So they're quite widely dispersed. Then you've got, and the Temminck's, just to go into a little bit more detail about it, they're nocturnal primarily. They extend their hours during winter. So forage sort of earlier in the afternoon and later into the morning. Solitary. And then occur mainly in savanna areas, grasslands. The black-bellied and white-bellied pangolin are both either arboreal, so the tree species, or semi-arboreal. The white-bellied pangolin is comfortable on the ground and in the trees. The black-bellied lives in tree canopies in thick forested areas, which are the most arboreal of the species. Just looking to see here, yeah, moist tropical lowland forests, basically. So the black-bellied lives 50 to 100 meters high in the canopy.
Wow.
That's high. And they disperse the canopy. The white-bellied is at home on the ground and in the trees. And they differ in that the white-bellied is diurnal, the black-bellied, sorry, is diurnal, which is interesting. It's the only diurnal species of all the pangolins. And the white-bellied is nocturnal, both solitary, and all pangolins are myrmecophagous, meaning that they feed on ants and termites exclusively.
Nice.
The white-bellied pangolin, I'm just looking to see their territory. They are basically in the northern parts of Angola and Zambia, so where the Temminck's ends, and then in a thick swathe across Central and West Africa. And then the black-bellied is across Central Africa and in areas on the west side of Africa up towards the bulge of Africa. And then the giant ground pangolin, which is the largest of the species, going up to 35 kgs, lives in dense forest, likes to live near to water, and they are also nocturnal, solitary, and the most poached of the species. They are endangered. The white-bellied are vulnerable with their numbers decreasing. The black-bellied are vulnerable with their numbers increasing, and the white-bellied are endangered. The Temminck's is vulnerable with its numbers decreasing. That's all according to the IUCN Red List. And you'll find that the Asian pangolin species are largely endangered or critically endangered. And it's been probably, the biggest reason or contributing factor for overharvesting in Africa for use in traditional Chinese medicine. So the trade has moved from China across to Africa. And the trade in scales for export to Asia is predominantly in the north. And the trade that we have is predominantly in live animals here in South Africa.
Okay, so you've touched on it just would you mind expanding on it a little bit? What's the motive? Was it for? Is it for medicine? Is it for, and more widely, what is there, other than just poaching and for illicit trade, what is the sort of human threats that are brought about that they're experiencing?
So we see the use of pangolin scales in Chinese traditional medicine as being the largest threat. And China has 1.4 billion people, and 70% of those rely on traditional Chinese medicine. Pangolin scales have always been used in traditional Chinese medicine. So that's completely unsustainable. And then, there are other threats, a myriad of other threats, which include deforestation from logging, where trade routes are opened up by logging concessions, and also a species like the black-bellied pangolin, which traverses a canopy, would need to come down to ground in order to climb up to the canopy on the other side, of a road, and that's where they get poached. And then human-wildlife conflict. So, as populations grow and expand into wild areas, and then agriculture, of course, expands. And then, especially in South Africa, and really a huge problem, possibly more so than the illegal wildlife trade, is that we have a wide net of electric fencing with a bottom tripwire that surrounds game ranching properties, wildlife reserves, protected areas, and it's almost extensive right throughout South Africa. So pangolins get caught on the bottom tripwire, they roll up into a ball, and then they're electrocuted until they die. Basically, electric fences keep predators in. So where you've got wild dogs that are wide-ranging and tend to predate on, agricultural stock, chickens, and other agriculture, animal agriculture, and then also keeps cats in, but is a huge problem for pangolins, pythons, birds, tortoises, and other small animals. And then, of course, the bushmeat trade, which was, so traditional and cultural, and pangolins have always been hunted for bushmeat. And while that was considered sustainable previously with population growth, it's really not anymore. And then you've got cultural or indigenous medicine in Africa, which is also considered sustainable because, not a lot of pangolin scale would be used for traditional medicine.
Okay, so I was literally just about to touch on bushmeat. Okay, so that brings us in nicely into, and you touched on it in your opening remarks, the background of the African Pangolin Working Group. So you want to tell us a little bit about how that came into being and the work that you are doing on the ground.
Thanks, Jack. So the African Pangolin Working Group was a loose association of scientists and conservationists who became aware of the problem with pangolins in around 2009. And the group was formally registered as an NGO in 2011. So we were one of probably 4 groups worldwide that had a specific focus on pangolins. And then 2 years ago, we were registered as an NPC, which is a non-profit company, and have continued as the conservation organizations for pangolins right throughout the world has increased. So myself and my co-chair are members of the IUCN Pangolin Specialist Group, which has grown from a handful of members to around 200 pangolin specialists around the world. And we collaborate and coordinate our efforts right throughout the world.
Fantastic. And what does that look like in practice for you day to day? What are you involved in? What are you up to?
So our organization has always, or traditionally, historically been an umbrella organization in South Africa, which deals with various different aspects of the trade. So we hold workshops for stakeholders, law enforcement and prosecutors, where we showcase various different aspects and background on the illegal trade in order to add value on the law enforcement and prosecution side. And we do these regularly with stakeholders right throughout South Africa and, outside of South Africa and across Africa, where these workshops will continue. And then we've been one of the writers in the standard operating procedure with government, our Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, for a standard operating procedure for pangolins retrieved out of the illegal trade here in South Africa. And that includes everything from the handling of a pangolin at a crime scene, the booking in of a pangolin at a police station, the documentation that needs to go along with that, and then pangolin specialist vets, stakeholder lists, DNA extraction, a chain of custody that needs to be in place. And then we do get involved in the rehabilitation of pangolins retrieved from the illegal wildlife trade and then their release into protected wildlife areas with telemetry, and then fund research, on release procedures, various different aspects of that. So those are basically the areas that we focus on, as well as awareness and interface, collaboration, relationship with communities and children in schools.
Oh, brilliant. On that very last point there, how do you feel that is there sort of a quite youthful, do you feel like the sort of advocacy that younger people are sort of getting involved and there is an energy, or how do you see things trending on that front?
I think that an involvement with conservation is not as much of an interest as it should be, and we always hope that that will increase. But there are wilderness schools that we're associated with that have done so much to change perception, educate children in conservation, mentor them right through into careers in conservation. And, the thing is that pangolins as a species belong to the stories and traditions and belief systems of indigenous cultures right throughout Africa. So those indigenous cultures generally support conservation of pangolins, and they're considered an iconic species right through Africa and Asia as well. And that's, unfortunately, probably the reason that they're so poached and that their body parts are used for healing modalities. And if we can, and we really believe this, support and strengthen the indigenous messaging right throughout the world, then I think that'll go a long way towards, creating a protection around pangolins, from the essence of indigenous communities worldwide. But there's, those relationships to indigenous culture and, traditions also has broken down over time. So young people are more westernized and, a lot more sort of connected with Western ideas. And unfortunately, those old traditions have also been lost over time.
And moving on to some of the stakeholders that you've mentioned there, other than you guys, are there plenty of other groups, do you think? Is there enough government involvement? How are things going on the wider front?
So in South Africa, things are quite well organized with a number of conservation organizations, vets and rehabilitation facilities that are specialist facilities, and so that's quite stable and well organized. But across Africa, in general, there's an increase in that in terms of landscape level strategies to combat illegal wildlife trade in pangolins, which is heartening, really quite positive. I mean, we would have said that pangolins have maybe got 10 years left before they become extinct. But there is a lot of effort being put into landscape level strategies, which we're involved in Kenya, across West Africa, in Southern Africa, and we're busy with a biodiversity management plan in South Africa. So a lot of, government involvement in all of those strategies. I mean, it's absolutely essential. Our mandate as an NGO, NPC, is to support government. So whatever we're doing, it's to support capacity, and our close relationship with government is essential. But I mean, government is central to all of this. So you've got wide regions right across Africa where the legislation differs, for example, and countries and regions within countries need to speak to each other, and it all needs to be, managed right across the landscapes of pangolins. But there are efforts in place.
Right, and I appreciate also that you're talking about 4 species across an enormous area, so many organizations and involvement. And I was wondering, to be a little bit more specific, is there a region or a species or a particular instance that has been really quite successful, and what lessons could be learned by other organizations or groups?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and we're all learning from each other all the time. So in South Africa, for example, where we are developing resource material and where things are possibly more advanced, maybe more progressive, or landscape level arrangements, strategies across the region, and where all of this is defined. And then the point is that it all needs to be actioned. So, for example, if we have a standard operating procedure for retrieving pangolins from the illegal wildlife trade, and it's all documented, we can share the template with an African country which is a pangolin range where they may not have a standard operating procedure, but get involved with their conservation people and their government authorities to create a template that's specific to them. And the same thing where we have, say, for example, a prosecution manual, which goes into all of our legislation in detail. Our conservation lawyers or environmental lawyers can work with theirs in formulating a prosecution manual that's specific to their area. And this then all becomes a resource material that can be used.
Fantastic. And in terms of, you mentioned that it was has been thought that pangolins might have only as much as 10 years left. What do you think are, obviously the worst case scenario would be extinction, but what might be the best case scenario? And how, in all honesty, do you think things are trending, or how might things develop?
I'm heartened by the landscape level strategies, but there's a huge amount of awareness and also alternative livelihood creation that needs to happen, where you're dealing with, poverty in Africa and a huge demand in Asia, which becomes a kind of storm of, critical conditions that create the the conditions for this animal that is actually a huge value as a natural resource and tourism, of course, and as an indigenous icon, and that has been on the planet for 85 million years. I mean, if you think of an antique table that we value that's over 100 years, and, the awareness of the value of our natural resources is just not there. So, how does one create awareness and uplift consciousness around these issues, create alternate livelihoods? I mean, it's a huge and complex kind of Rubik's Cube. And then you've got this massive demand in Asia. And, while China is a signatory to CITES and they're always present at CITES conventions, what they do within their country, so regionally, is not governed by CITES at all. So it doesn't matter what CITES, how much CITES restricts the trade. And pangolins are an Appendix 1 animal on CITES, so there's absolutely no trade allowed. But within a region, how pangolins are protected and the legislation that governs their protection is varies and is within only the mandate of the government of that country.
Of course. And finally, Alexis, where can our audience find you if they want to support you or get involved with your work?
Thanks, Jack. Oh, and one thing I really wanted to just mention to you, because you mentioned that you are involved with reintroductions.
Yep.
And we've got a fantastically successful reintroduction project of pangolins into an area where they've been ecologically extinct for 40 years, which is in Zululand, so KwaZulu-Natal, in a collaboration with a Phinda Private Game Reserve there and Manyoni Game Reserve, where we've reintroduced pangolins. And I think 25 pangolins retrieved from the illegal wildlife trade. So that's really a world first, who have been rehabilitated and released back into both of those environments, have have had pups, I think 5 pups at least in both cases, and pups dispersing now into a wider area. So I would say that that's a great conservation success and would also be a template for the reintroduction of pangolins into other areas where they've become ecologically extinct. And then, Jack, to answer your question, we're a presence on the internet, both via our website, which is www.africanpangolin.org, and we have a presence on Instagram,